Hi, everybody. I'm going to today complete our lecture on the skeletal system, talking about specific examples of bones and joints and other structures that are going to be covered in lab as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, now we're going to be talking about the axial skeleton. So if you remember, that was the skull as well as the vertebra, the sternum, and the costa. Let's begin by looking at the bones of the skull. There are 8 bones which are considered to be the bones that create the cranial cavity. So if you take a look right here where we've separated out the skull, you can see that all around the space that will later be occupied by the brain, we have these cranial bones. That includes one frontal bone, one bone here called the occipital. We have a single ethmoid, a single sphenoid, so that's 4, and then there's paired left and right parietals and paired left and right temporals. So if you consider this as a single unit, it will surround the brain, attach to the vertebra, and also attach to the jaw. Looking from an inferior view, we can locate some of the structures that are critical to this, this cranium. We have the occipital condyles, and notice it's part of the occipital bone. These condyles are on either side of the large opening. This large opening is the foramen magnum. And the occipital condyles are going to make a joint with a bone called the atlas, which is the first cervical vertebrae. And this joint allows your head to make a nodding motion. So if you move your head backward and forward, like you're nodding yes, this is between those 2 bones. And we can also see from here the other joint I mentioned, which is, turn that off, which is with the mandible. Okay, so right here and right here, we have the mandibular fossa, and this is part of the temporal bone, and it is where the mandible will connect. That's the jaw joint. Okay, moving down to the bones of the face, we have 14 bones here. Most are paired. There's a couple of singletons. We have this little one here you see called the vomer. We have the mandible. These are both considered single bones. And then everything else is paired. We have the inferior nasal concha, which I'll show you a little later, palatines, zygomatic, lacrimal, nasal, and maxilla bones. So these make up the bones associated with the mouth and also much of the eye, the lower portion of the eye and the nose. If you look inside the orbits, you're going to see that it's actually a very complicated structure, which has contributions from a lot of different bones. I'm not going to ask you to memorize all of these, but it is helpful to look at the bones that make up the orbital rim. That is the edge of the orbit. Okay, so here in yellow, this is the frontal bone, and that is part of that series of bones we associate with the cranium. And then inferior, we've got the zygomatic bone, and we've got the maxilla. So these 2 are facial bones, and they make up the bottom, say, 2/3 or so of the orbital rim. Okay, I want to talk about a structure called the bony palate. This is the roof of your mouth, and it's made up of 2 different pairs of bones. The anterior and the largest portion is made up of the maxilla bone. So you can see here's the right maxilla. So the maxilla is the bone that holds all your upper teeth. And then posterior, these are the pair of palatines. So these 2 palatines plus these 2 maxillas makes up the bony palate. This structure is important. Actually, it's an important evolutionary structure because in animals like ourselves that eat a lot and breathe a lot, it allows us to separate eating our food in our mouth from breathing through our noses. Okay, so that's this bony separation. Now, another structure we see associated with the skull is this one here. It's called the zygomatic arch. And it's a portion of two bones that creates a space. So behind the arch is a space. And in that space, we're going to find muscles for chewing. We'll look at those later. But the arch itself runs from here to here. So it's made up of contributions of the zygomatic bone and the temporal bone. So these processes have names which at first seem kind of silly. The temporal bone has a zygomatic process, and the zygomatic bone has a temporal process, this shorter piece right here. So I think of these processes as being named for the bone that they're reaching out to touch. So here we have a zygomatic process that's going to touch the zygomatic bone, and we have a temporal process that's going to touch the temporal bone. Now, the nasal concha. We're looking here at a mid-sagittal section of the skull, and here is a mid-sagittal through that bony palate that we just learned about, the hard palate. Okay, these are the concha. There's 1, 2, 3. So all three of these are curved, thin, bony structures, and they help to move the air around inside this really sizable nasal cavity. And in doing so, it allows us to do what's called conditioning the air, making the air at the right humidity and the right temperature before you pass that air down into your lungs. And lung tissue is really quite sensitive. So you don't want the air to be too drying or too hot, for example, before it goes into the lungs. The top two, here and here, are called the superior nasal concha and the middle nasal concha, and they're part of the ethmoid bone. And then down here is the inferior nasal concha, which we've discovered is actually its own separate bone. So middle nasal concha is a structure of the ethmoid bone, but the inferior nasal concha is not a structure, it's the entire bone itself. Moving on now to the sinuses, or what we'll call the paranasal sinuses. These are the sinuses you know that you might get a sinus infection or you might get sinus pressure. And what they are spaces inside of bones. Okay, so they're air spaces and they're continuous with the nasal cavity. And the openings to these sinuses can be quite small, which is one reason why they can get blocked up by an infection or something like that and lead to a nasty sinus infection. You can see from an anterior view that we have a frontal sinus pair. Even though the frontal bone is a single bone, we have a pair of frontal sinuses. We have a pair of large maxillary sinuses. You can see here as well from a mid-sagittal. And then the smaller ethmoid sinus, we have a single ethmoid bone, and it's got lots of these air spaces in it. And then way back here is the sphenoid sinus that's within the sphenoid bone. Okay, sutures. Sutures are where one flat bone forms a joint with another flat bone. And between these pieces of bone will be a fairly thin layer of dense, regular connective tissue. As you age, these joints close and eventually disappear altogether. And that's what we mean by fusing. So that what once was two separate pieces of bone is now going to grow together into one. As these sutures fuse, we can use that information to help us age an older skull. But in young people, in your 20s and 30s, these will not yet be fused together. The names of these four are shown below, and the best way to locate them is to focus in on a single parietal bone. Right, here's the parietal bone. Okay, remember we have a left and a right. We're looking down on it, so this is the superior view. And the first suture is here between the two parietal bones. and that's called a sagittal suture. So that goes along with what we learned about planes. The next one is here in the front. It's between the frontal bone and the parietal bone. So this is called coronal, the coronal suture. Okay, so these two are just like the plane names that we'd learned. Now the other two are seen not from a superior view. We have a posterior image here, and this is going to show us the lambdoid suture, which is between the occipital bone and the parietal. And then let me jump ahead for a second to look at a lateral view, because the last suture is here. This is the squamous suture, and it's between the parietal bone and the temporal bone. So if you consider the parietal bone to be pretty much four-sided, 1, 2, we can't really see the third side very well, and then coming up the back of the fourth side, each of these sides is going to make a suture. All right, now the skull and how it grows. When you're first born, you actually have a surprisingly large skull, and the pieces of bone are separate from one another, again by sutures, but the sutures are a lot bigger at birth. Okay, and that allows these bones to move around as the baby passes through the birth canal. So babies can have really funny looking heads when they're first born because the bones can be overlapping or sort of pushed up on one another. But after a few days, the bones will return to where they normally are. And now the bones can continue to grow toward one another until these sutures become quite thin, like you saw in the adult skull. So here the sagittal suture of a newborn is really large. Okay, and we've got now there's our coronal suture. In the back here was our lambdoid suture, and on the side here is our squamous suture. But we're going to add to this what are called the fontanelles. They are also made of dense, regular connective tissue, and they're continuous with the sutures. So you go suture right into a fontanelle. So if the sutures are along the four edges of the parietal bone, you're going to find the fontanelles at the four corners of the parietal bone. So here we have the first corner, anterior fontanelle, second corner, posterior fontanelle, third corner, sphenoidal fontanelle, fourth corner, mastoidal or mastoid fontanelle. You will also see the terms anterior lateral fontanelle and posterior lateral fontanelle. Okay, so the largest is this one here, the anterior fontanelle, and people commonly refer to that as a soft spot, and those disappear on kids pretty quickly. And these bones will have grown pretty close together, and the fontanelles will have disappeared by the time a child is age 5. So the size of the cranium is adult size by about age 5. All right, in the body, part of the axial skeleton includes these small bones that don't articulate. They don't make joints with other bones. This first one, the hyoid, is the only bone in your body that really doesn't touch any other bone. Okay, the hyoid is sort of a U-shaped structure, and it has these projections, and they're called horns or cornu. And if you look over here at the image, you're going to see that a whole bunch of muscles attach to the structures of the hyoid. But the hyoid itself sits posterior to the mandible. And so the best way to see it is to tip the head way back like this model has. So once you lift the mandible up out of the way, the hyoid is behind it. Okay, so the hyoid doesn't touch any other bones. The auditory ossicles, on the other hand, are over here on the right-hand side. This is showing them life size. They're really tiny little bones. And these three are found in the ear of a human. And they touch one another, but they don't touch anything else. So the deepest of all is the stapes, which touches the incus, which touches the malleus. So they go from superficial malleus to deep stapes. And we'll learn about them when we learn later about how we sense sound. The vertebrae of the body are shown here, and they're separated into 5 different categories. Cervical vertebra, Remember, that's the cervical region, the neck. The thoracic vertebra, so that's found near the thoracic cavity, and the lumbar or lower back, okay? And the numbers of them are shown here. So there's 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, and 5 lumbar. So usually people remember this as the time when old people eat, the breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, and the early bird special at 5 o'clock. The remaining vertebrae are actually fused together to form single structures. The sacrum, which we saw before as part of the pelvis, is a fusion of 5 separate vertebrae, but it forms a single bony structure in the adult. And then the coccyx, or what you might know as the tailbone, is a fusion typically of 4 vertebrae, although there's a little variation in that number. Now, how one vertebra meets another is kind of complicated. So focus here on this center vertebra. Okay, this is the 3rd lumbar vertebra. Above it is lumbar vertebra 2, and below it is lumbar vertebra 4. Now see how they touch. Focus right in on here. This piece of bone extends upward. Okay, that's called the superior articulating process. So process is a bony projection. And then here's another superior articulating process. And on that process, shown here in blue, is a flat surface known as a facet. Okay, it's shown in blue because it's going to be covered in a hyaline cartilage, the articular cartilage. So the superior articulating facet is the flat surface of the superior articulating process that touches the vertebra that sits superior to itself. Okay, so these two are touching here at this blue line. That's where the facets are. Now extending downward is an inferior articulating process. So that whole bony piece is the process. But if we could look on the other side of this image, you'd see another facet, a flat surface that will touch the vertebra that's going to sit below. That facet will be the inferior articulating facet. So you can see here, now that we've turned to a lateral view, you can see the inferior articulating facet. Okay, so we're continuing to focus on how these vertebrae fit together, but now we're looking from a lateral view. And you can see that between each vertebra, laterally, we have a hole that is visible. It's called the intervertebral foramen. So that just means literally between the vertebra hole. So this hole right here is so that spinal nerves can enter and exit the vertebral column. How you make this hole is a function of one structure above and another structure below. Each of these half circles is known as a notch. Now, if you consider this vertebra, this notch is on its superior surface. So this is called the superior notch. This notch here is on the inferior surface of its bone. So this is the inferior notch. If you put together the superior notch of one vertebra with the inferior notch of another vertebra, that creates a hole. That's your intervertebral foramen. Now, let's look at some detail of the actual vertebra themselves. Remember, we have 7 cervical vertebrae, and the first 2 are really funny looking. This is cervical vertebra number 1, the atlas, and this is cervical vertebrae number 2, the axis. So the atlas has these big, wide, flat, superior articulating facets because that articulates with the occipital condyles that I showed you of the occipital bone. And that joint or articulation is what allows you to nod. On the other hand, when you fit these 2 together, this little bony projection you see called the dens, or another name for it is odontoid process, this little projection sticks up into the space of the atlas. And the articulation between the two of them allows you to rotate your head. So if you turn your head to the right, you turn your head to the left, that's rotation. So the atlas moves around this single point of rotation of the axis bone. So you could call these bones atlas and axis, or you can call them cervical vertebrae 1, cervical vertebrae number 2. Moving down to the thoracic vertebra, they have some extra complexity because these vertebrae articulate with the costa, or ribs. Okay, so notice these extra articular surfaces. Okay, we've got 4 extra articulating surfaces. Okay, first we have a demicostal facet that is superior and a demicostal facet that is inferior. Okay, demi means half or part of a facet. So the superior demicostal facet is going to touch a rib, and the inferior demicostal facet is going to touch another rib. Okay, so there'll be a rib sitting here and a rib sitting here. Okay, and then, sorry, I said 4, there's only 3 extras. That's the superior articulating facet. And then the last extra structure is here, the transverse costal facet, and it's found on the transverse process, and that also articulates with a rib or a costa. So we're going to touch 2 ribs, but we've got 3 different places that we're going to do it. So take a look at this drawing and see if you can figure this out. Okay, here is the rib, the costa, coming in to articulate with this thoracic vertebra and this one below it. Okay, so here is where the head of the rib articulates with the inferior demifacet of this vertebra, and then below it with the superior demifacet of this rib. Okay, so we've got those 2 demicostal facets. Here's one up here, superior demicostal facet, and then here's one down here that is an inferior demicostal facet. All right, then over here is the 3rd place that the rib can touch. That is the transverse costal facet. Okay, so by having so many places where the rib touches, it actually means there's very little movement between the rib and the thoracic vertebra. Okay, let's go into the sternum. Remember that coordinated with the sternal region. These are just the structures that you see deep. And this whole thing is the sternum. It has 3 parts, the manubrium, the body, and the xiphoid process. The xiphoid process starts off as cartilage, as you see in this image, and will later ossify or harden into bone, right? That process of ossification that we already went over. All right, so the manubrium articulates with 1 rib, just this rib right here, rib number 1. The body articulates with all the remaining ribs that are able to articulate. What I mean is it articulates with 2 through 7 and also 8 through 10. There are 2 ribs that are known as floating ribs. Here they are, 11 and 12, and those 2 are too short. They don't even have the costal cartilage to come around and articulate with the body. So shown in brown, that is representing the hyaline cartilage, okay, and 2 through 7, or actually 1 through 7, are considered to be true ribs because they directly articulate to bone. And then these guys down here, 8, 9, 10, are considered to be false ribs. They articulate basically back through the hyaline cartilage of other ribs. Okay. Now let's just cover a few simple review questions just so you can go over what we've talked about. So first of all, ask yourself, how many cranial bones are there? And how many facial bones are there? Okay, the answer is 8 and 14. Name a bone in the body that does not articulate with any other bone. That was the one in the neck, remember? Okay, so that's the hyoid bone, or hyoid. The costa, or ribs, articulate with which vertebra? So of those many types of vertebra, which one? Think about what region it's in. Okay, so that's going to be the thoracic vertebra. Hopefully you know how many there are. There should be 12 of those for lunchtime. What type of cartilage is found in the intervertebral discs? Now this is a stinky review question because this goes back to Unit 1. But remember when we were studying cartilage, we talked about one type of cartilage was really good at absorbing stress or pressure. You couldn't push through this material. Okay, so this is the toughest type of cartilage, and that's known as fibrocartilage. If you remembered this, then well done. If not, well, you'll have some time later to review before we get to the final exam. We still have some time. All right, so this is all I'm going to be saying about the specific bones in lecture. Most of the learning and studying of bones is being covered in lab. Let me know if you have any questions or if there's any problems with the video. And remember, you can always email me. So take care of yourself, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.